Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future. My name is Zach Gardner. I'm the Chief Architect at Keyhole Software, and today I have a very interesting presentation for those of you that are nerds like me and want to know more about GitHub Copilot. About 3 weeks ago, I got a wild hair because I had heard so much talk on all these different forums about GitHub Copilot this, GitHub Copilot that. So I wanted to see if there was anything behind the hype. This is a presentation that gives you at least a little bit of a flavor in terms of what GitHub Copilot is. We're going to talk through security considerations, policy considerations, things that people at the C-suite need to be thinking about. If you want to know more about GitHub Copilot and actually go into deep dives in terms of its technical capabilities, that would be GitHub Copilot 201 or 301. Now, 101, we're just talking about what do you need to be thinking about? What frame of reference can you get into so that you can figure out, is this tool for me or is it a little too sus and I need to figure something else out? Now, this presentation, again, GitHub Copilot 101, a chief architect's journey. As you can tell, it's very outer space, very, exploratory. We're our heads in the clouds a little bit, which that's okay. It's okay. We need to understand things at a high level and then we'll move slightly down. So, to start it off with, who is this crazy person that you are listening to right now on whatever favorite platform that you're using to listen to this? Zach Gardner, as I said, Zach the Snack is what my friends call me. My main job is to architect all of the applications that we put out for all of our clients. I do mostly, healthcare is sort of my sweet spot, but I do architecture for energy, I do architecture for media companies, I do architecture for pretty much any vertical that you can think of. It's primarily B2B, a few B2C scenarios, but it's mostly when a company wants to increase their revenue, when they want to decrease operational costs, and they want to do so, but they can't find anything off the shelf to do it, that's where we come in. So that's my bias, just so that we're all very clear. This is my frame of reference. I'm not a senior developer, I'm not a team, I am an architect, I'm a chief architect. And Keyhole Software, if you don't know about us, you're going to, because we are going to be pushing out a lot of content this year to make sure that everyone knows about us. About 100 people based here, mostly in Kansas City, not in the future, as, as this background might lead you to believe, contrary to popular belief. All senior level developers. We did have an internship program a few years ago, but it's not really our niche. So if you're looking for egalitarian advice, if you're looking for really good thought leadership pieces, make sure to check out wherever you get your content because we're probably going to be publishing out there. So why GitHub Copilot? There are other tools, granted, in this sphere that are other ones that I could have used. However, when I approach the way I architect a solution, I really try to stay away from the things that are just so nichey that you're going to have a PhD in one particular field to even understand what's going on, or it's maintained by someone in their parents' garage. The architecture of software that I work on, the kind of projects that we work on at Keyhole, they have to be enterprise grade, meaning it has to be something that is well understood, commonly accepted in the community, and it should be easy with some relative degree to be able to find people to work on these technologies. And the more niche you get, the more you pigeonhole yourself into it. So we want to try to stay above the fray. We want to look at not just what bleeding edge, because we don't want anyone to get cut, but maybe leading edge is a better way to think about it. GitHub Copilot on GitHub, which means it's from Microsoft, kind of take what you will. Everyone has their own opinions about Microsoft. That's a separate video cast. There's some good things about it. There's some things that I like, but it's the thing that everyone is talking about. So it's going to be easy to find really good opinions on it. When you run into trouble, it's going to be easy to find other people that have maybe gone through those experiences and can give you at least some words of wisdom in terms of where your head should be at. Now, important to note, this is not a video cast series where I am being paid by Microsoft to hawk their content. This is not a sales pitch. There's no timeshare at the end. This is something just I, as a chief architect, felt it necessary to go out to research and then to share the information that I'm finding. Microsoft is not paying us in any way. I do have to disclose that we are a Microsoft Gold partner, but we're also an AWS partner as well, and probably eventually a Google Cloud partner as well. So no conflict of interest there. More importantly, this is a 101 course. There's going to be things that we're going to talk about that might give you a better insight into should you be using this, how you could be using this, but it is not a blanket recommendation to say this is something that you need to be using today. So just so we're all clear about that. The first thing that you're going to run into when you go to sign up for GitHub Copilot is the dollar bills, y'all. Now, if you're working in a company like what we typically work for at Keyhole Software, your organization is going to have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft for use of a lot of their services. Microsoft Azure, O365, GitHub Enterprise. GitHub Copilot would fall under that umbrella, and so it would be licenses that would be procured by the procurement department, I think. Or no, it'd be, everyone does it slightly differently. That would then be assigned to the individual developers that need to use it. So the developers themselves don't have to shell any money out of their own pockets. If you're going the route of someone who just wants to experiment with GitHub Copilot, just kind of wants to see what all the hype is about, definitely choose the GitHub Copilot individual option and make sure that you use your handy dandy reminder tool on your phone to remind you that this is a 30-day free trial. And I know it's $10 per month, per year, but it's the principle of the thing. Come on, it's the principle of the thing. But it's free, fine, very easy to get started off. So after you smash that sort of free trial button, after you go through and give them your credit card information, then you're met with this lovely screen, which is innocuous, but it really shouldn't be. There should be like red lights on this page, like danger, Will Robinson, because the two options on there have a lot of nuance behind them. So let's spend some time understanding that before we go any farther. The first is that should you be able to receive recommendations from GitHub Copilot for code that comes from the public. Now, there's a certain amount of litigation that's currently in play in terms of what are the tools that OpenAI was using, what documents were they using to train their models off of. I believe it's New York Times v. OpenAI, because their contention is that OpenAI trained their code, and probably GitHub Copilot as well, on things that were either not licensed for public use or potentially proprietary, and they probably shouldn't have been training it off anyway. I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying this is what people have said. This is what I've heard people say. Now, that's true. And you open yourself up to a certain amount of litigation if you're on GitHub. I have heard, just to be clear, I'm a chief architect. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. All my friends that did go to law school tell me that that was a very wise decision. Not saying anything is bad about lawyers. Anyway, if you ask it for some recommendations, it gives you some code. You copy and paste the code into your code base. You do a git push. That thing goes up to production in 5 minutes because we're in a true CI/CD environment. And that code is under a GPL license. Well, that might not be so good because it sourced it from a place that it probably shouldn't have. And then you have now taken it, put it into your code base without proper attribution. There are some nuances here, especially when it comes to indemnification. I think I said that word right, to where you can't be sued for GitHub Copilot giving you code that was under copyright without proper attribution. But do you really want to risk it? I don't know if I would. So I would almost say if you're using this for private use, if you're using this for a company, I would really shy away from that allowed option. And this option, as well as the one underneath it, I believe can actually be set at an org level in your GitHub Enterprise account. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that should really be something that is an organizational policy. It's something that your CISO needs to understand. It's something that your secure codings work groups need to understand, something that your chief counsel needs to understand, just to make sure that you're not opening yourself up to any obvious sources of potential litigation. So with that in mind, if you're just testing this out, smash that allowed button, and then let's move on. The second option is a checkbox. Little less innocuous, but still potentially as inimical. It allows GitHub, if you check it, to be able to use the code that you give it as you're interacting with GitHub Copilot to be able to help improve the product, which is code for we can potentially train subsequent iterations of our model with your code that you put into it, whether you like it or not, even though you agreed to it. Now, the part that I am suspicious about on this particular checkbox, when you're interacting with GitHub Copilot, you're actually going to be interacting via HTTPS calls. You're going to be sending it your source code as you're typing it out, and then it needs that in order to make recommendations on the coding style that you're doing, what libraries that you're doing, what methods you want to put in there, what variables you want to put in there, all that stuff. It needs that broader context to be able to give you exactly what you're looking for, which means that you're sending it your code, which means that if that code is under a copyright, it is under many IP protections, intellectual property protections, you're sending that code out. Now, granted, if you're on GitHub anyway, they technically have your Git repository, but they're not actively scanning your code. You're not exposing your code over the public internet. You're not giving them the privilege of being able to train subsequent versions of their model against your copywritten code. So this is the other part that kind of scares me. When we use something like IntelliSense, if we're in Visual Studio, all of that is local. The recommendations are local. The code stays local. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Whereas with GitHub Copilot, it's running on some server somewhere, probably in Microsoft Azure. And you're sending that code over the wire, hoping there's not a man in the middle. So there's a certain amount of hesitation and a certain amount of risk that we should understand when we embark on these kind of endeavors. So if you're using this for a B2B app where it's proprietary, you don't want your source code exposed to the public to be able to say, hey, what is company X doing for this particular method? Then you might want to consider unselecting that option at an organization level. Again, this would really be an organization level. So now we've gone through our setup process. Now we're like, all right, how do I use it? That's a very good question. In fact, I had that exact same question. I thought I was done because I was like, where is it? So first, I do mostly .NET development as part of my day job. I do not as much development as I would like, but that's a different story. So I'll be using Visual Studio for this particular example. The same concepts apply to JetBrains, to Visual Studio Code, to Sublime. I don't know who's using Sublime these days. Slide into my DMs if you are like to talk to you, because it's an interesting technical choice. So to get us started with, in Visual Studio, we're going to go to the extensions. We're going to search for GitHub Copilot, hit that download button, and then be presented with a message that, oh, well, I need to close Visual Studio. So then you close Visual Studio, you click Modify, there's like 4 or 5 other buttons that you need to click. And then it's like, all right, okay, cool. I've got the extension installed. How does it know who I am? Okay, well, you need to go to account settings. You need to add your GitHub account. And then it knows who you are. Now for me, for whatever reason, I needed to remove and add my GitHub account a few times. I don't know if that's the way that our Azure AD, or what do they call it now, Azure Intra, I think, is set up. Don't know. But if you run into any issues where it says you're not authorized, just try to add it and remove it a few times, and that seemed to be good enough. So I'm like, okay, I got the extension installed. I got authentication taken into play. What do I do now? Okay, well, that's a great question. I need to have some sort of code base that it's going to be able to make recommendations off of, because after all, GitHub Copilot is a code copilot. Create a new project, going to be a console app. I'm just going to go with my typical, if you've ever seen one of my presentations, I usually use some sort of automotive dealership practice. I don't know, I think they're better than a to-do app, to be honest. .NET 8, because YOLO. And then, okay, so I've created my console application. And now there's 2 things that it shows you. The first, at the top, it says, this fancy little notice, GitHub Copilot is now enabled. Start typing to receive predictions or read the documentation. And because I am a really good developer, and I'm always going to be a developer at heart, I made sure to smash that do not show this again button. I'm not reading the documentation. I'm going 100 miles per hour. The second thing that it shows you is on that output screen. It will say successfully authorized GitHub Copilot. It says it twice because once was not good enough. But this is where you're going to be able to see some of the diagnostics for what's going on behind the scenes with GitHub Copilot, which will be important about 9 slides from now. So I create a new class. I call it the inventory service because I'm going to have it interact with some API, enforce some business rules, and then be able to return potentially inventory back to the caller. This is what they're going to use to interact with if they want to do CRUD operations against inventory. Not win any Nobel Prizes for this. But as soon as I create the class, type in public, and then tab to accept. This is new. You can notice it looks a lot like IntelliSense because it is IntelliSense. Granted, it is a very fancy version of IntelliSense, but IntelliSense nonetheless. So I'm like, okay, I don't want to create my constructor yet. I'm going to work on a function that will give back to the caller the list of cars that are in the inventory for this particular auto dealership. So I start, as I always do, public, IEnumerable, and then I pause because I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who's a junior developer who might not know the difference between IEnumerable and IOrderedQueryable and IList and ICollection, and I can't think of any other examples right now, but I'm sure there are. I'm sure that's an interface somewhere in Java because they have long class names. So I'm like, okay, this is good. I have a question that I want to ask it, very specific about code. What are some of my options that I can use for this return type? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What's the context where I want to use these? So I didn't see anything in the IDE, and of course, as any good developer, I didn't read the documentation. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go and see if there's a chat available where I can interact with GitHub chat. Outside the context of the code I'm working on, I just wanted to ask it more broadly, what's the difference between these different interface types? So there is a chat. It's not very well thought of. It only has not even 3 stars. It's like 2, that's oddly specific, Microsoft. That's like 2.8 stars, I think. And it's, it has a fair amount of installs, 203,000. It's nothing to scoff at. But it's not as widely used as the GitHub Copilot extensions. Like, all right, fine, whatever. I install the extension, I have to restart Visual Studio, it has to install, and then I'm like, okay, now I get this view GitHub Copilot chat. And on the Solution Explorer on the right-hand side, or next to the Solution Explorer, it brings up this chat. So I'm like, okay, well, this is cool, but now that I think about it, I kind of want to ask it questions specific to my code base. So I'm just gonna slide that off, pretend I didn't see that, and then go back. So I'm like, okay, I know with IntelliSense that I can sometimes right click and it will say, oh, code complete. That's fine. So I right click and I'm like, here we go. Ask Copilot. Don't mind if I do. So I see this text area pop up with an area where I can type in my, very well formed, very well thought out, if I'm, being nice to myself, question. And I notice that above it, it says AI suggestions may be inaccurate. This is one important point to understand. With these large language model tools, they're not designed to be able to give you the correct answer. Correctness, it's not necessarily in the eye of the beholder, but it is to a certain degree objective. What they're designed to do is they are probability machines. They're designed to give you what it thinks is the most probable answer to the question that you're asking. And if you've ever asked it some very odd questions like, what's the name of the first elephant to walk on the moon? It will say, oh, that elephant's name was Dumbo, and they came from this particular circus, and this is Dumbo's lineage. Even though, I'm pretty sure, I'm like 99.99% sure there hasn't been an elephant that walked on the moon. Maybe. I don't think so, but maybe. Because it's not designed to give you something that's correct. That's a very different proposition than how they're designed as a probability machine. So keep that in the back of your mind. This is the context around where we use these tools. It's giving you what it thinks is the most probable answer to your question, which might include security flaws, it might include performance issues, but it is certainly the most probable answer. So I type in my question and I make mistake number one. The first mistake that I made when asking this question is I asked too many questions. You all know me. I can be loquacious at times. I like to get in a lot of different information. And I think that I gave it, as you can tell from the response that I'll show here in a second, I think I just asked it too many questions and it forgot some of the things that I asked it. But I smash that send button and then it gives me the information that I asked for. What I like about this is that if I were to go and compare these different types on my own, I'd have to have multiple different tabs open of Microsoft, MSDN. They have a different name. I think this is called Microsoft Docs now, if I remember right. And I would have to go side by side. I'd have to get all that information and coalesce it in my brain. I would have to try to really grok what it is that the answers were, the different nuances between all these types. And then I would have to figure out, where do I use them in this scenario? Where do I use them in that scenario? But instead, what these large language model tools are really good at are being able to take disparate documents and be able to synthesize some sort of understanding together that takes pieces of all of these and gives it into a cohesive and highly probable narrative. And that's what it gave me. It told me this is what an IEnumerable was, this is what an IList was, this is what, some of the performance considerations, compatibility considerations, and then it even gave me recommendations for other things that I could ask it. So that was 75% of what I asked it in the initial question. The other 25%, I probably should have separated out into its own question, or maybe asked follow-up questions based on what it gave me. Because I said, what are some of my options, including IEnumerable, I ordered list, or I ordered enumerable, I list, but what are some of the other things that I could be using? And maybe it hallucinated slightly and just totally forgot that I asked it that question because it didn't answer that at all. So I had to ask the question again. So that's okay. It's not perfect. We're all human here. Some of us are a bit more electron specific than others. But then once I asked it, it said, okay, I collection, you can use that. I read-only collection, I list. And this is really good, especially for a junior developer. One of the things that I'm really concerned about sort of existentially with these kind of tools is that developers that are up and coming, junior developers, people that are just graduating from code academies or from four-year universities, they're not going to develop the same kind of muscle memory, the same kind of neurological pathways that we as senior software developers have to be able to understand, how do I keep all my business requirements in my head? How do I model my application through data and entities that relate to each other? How do I look at a particular solution and say, all right, here's the 4 options that I could use. 3 of them I've used in the past and I know how to do them. And the one, this is what I'm going to go with because it's this particular type of problem. That's something that just comes from doing this over and over and over again. It's the 10,000 hour problem that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about. You have to put in the time to be able to really master your craft. And generative AI tools like GitHub Copilot, if they give people the ability to do things that are maybe 2 or 3 steps beyond where they're at in terms of their maturity level in being a software developer, that might lead to some suboptimal results because they don't have the scar tissue. They don't have just the inherent knowledge. They don't have the frame of reference to know how to make these trade-offs. The good part, though, that I do like, and the part that I am cautiously optimistic on, is that it does give them the ability to say, all right, this is, as long as you know how to ask the question correctly in GitHub Copilot, here are your options, here are performance considerations, here's compatibility considerations, and here's some other things that you can ask me. So this is really good because one of the things that we in the software community lack is a really strong mentorship program. We just often leave junior developers to their own devices, which can be good because you got to learn some strong habits, you got to get your mental faculties in order to be able to handle the rigors of being a software developer. But it can also be bad because they can go off into left field and start doing some crazy stuff. And it's not until code review time that you sometimes realize that they implemented exactly what the business asked for, but you know as a senior developer, that's not what they actually wanted. Or they implemented it, but it is not implemented in such a way that it can be maintained. So I do like the fact that GitHub Copilot can take a set of code and say, hey, GitHub Copilot, recommend me how I can do this slightly differently. Are there any obvious performance issues that you see here? Are there any obvious security issues? You still do need a human at the end of the day to be able to adjudicate and to be able to be the one that says, yes, this is what I want. So just keep all that little soapbox in the back of your head. Now, I asked it about performance considerations between the types that it recommended me previously. So there is a certain amount of memory that GitHub Copilot has. Even though it doesn't look like it is a long-running discussion, when you ask it a question, you can ask it questions in the context of what you've already talked about in that conversation. What you can't do is say, hey, GitHub Copilot, remember 17 days ago when you recommended that I use an I collection? Well, that was dumb. I really don't like you anymore. You stink. Recommend me something else. It's going to be like, brah, I don't remember that conversation at all. So you have to keep your conversations in that particular context. It is a narrative, and as soon as you close it, it is gone to the ether. So that's okay. This is not, not crazy. So I was like, all right, after all that, I'm just going to use an I enumerable. I know the differences between them. This is what I want to go with. It's a lazy load. I want to make sure that I defer the loading until the last moment possible. It's exactly what I need. Perfectly fine. But then, on a whim, I expanded the window that shows me what the diagnostics were within GitHub Copilot. As you can see, go to the next slide, as I was typing my method for git inventory, it was able to debounce. So it's not like it sends a request to the GitHub Copilot API every single time you click on a key or move the mouse a pixel or two. It does a debounce so that it waits until there's some meaningful amount of interaction that was done to be able to send it off and get additional IntelliSense type ahead recommendations. So it's interesting to know, because what if the code that you're working on is copywritten? If it is the intellectual property of the organization that you were developing the software for, and you unknowingly and unwittingly are sending GitHub Copilot your company's proprietary code. This is the part that should scare, I don't know if that's the right adjective, verb, scare, yeah, to scare, verb, to use. It's something that we need to be concerned about for sure, because we don't have full chain of custody anymore over our source code. Granted, it can't inject anything, but we are giving it our source code. Even if your code is hosted on GitHub, it's still in a private repository, and there's still a reasonable expectation of privacy, of security, of control. If you're sending it over the wire to some API and they are using that to improve future versions of their product, there's no chance there's a non-zero chance, if you opt into that someone is going to figure out how to jailbreak the LLM and ask it, hey, the company that this developer was working for, what did you recommend for the git inventory method, and what were all the classes that were in that solution, and what are some of the secrets that they don't want me to know about? There's a non-zero chance. Granted, it's small, but it is non-zero. We can reduce that down to zero if GitHub Copilot were either A, running locally on our machines, or B, we were able to configure GitHub Copilot to hit just a private instance for our organization. I think that's honestly what we're going to see in 2024. The ability to have bring your own key encrypted behind a firewall, where we can have our own instance of GitHub Copilot as a managed service that still got to pay for, but it gives you a greater amount of control over what is the recipient of your amazing Git inventory method. I got my Git inventory method and now I need to fill it out with something. So I'm putting on my junior developer hat, I haven't worn that for many decades, and I say, all right, I have an API that I want to call out to cars.com because that was what I was thinking about when I was, there's probably a cars.com commercial or something when I was looking at this event. This is an API that I can hit, give me the code to do it, and I want to serialize that to the car class that I made. Now it's interesting because I haven't yet defined what my car class is going to be, as you can tell from the little red squiggles, but it understood what I wanted to do. And it gives you this interface, very much like a git commit. On the left-hand side, oh, sorry, on the, left-hand side, sorry, my screen is split. On the side where it has the red, I guess I'll say it like that, it gives you the ability to see what the code is like right now. And on the other side, whichever direction that may be, it gives you the ability to see what it is that your code will look like if you were to implement the recommendation. And you can accept the recommendation, you can give it a thumbs up, a thumbs down. Again, AI suggestions may be inaccurate. Thanks, GitHub Copilot. Of course I love inaccurate code. Who doesn't these days? And it put async task on my method too because I understood that it was going to do an async await. That's pretty cool. I mean, like, I didn't tell it to do that, but it knew that it probably wanted to use HTTP client. There's probably 100 different ways that you can do an HTTP request in C#. HTTP client, I mean, I probably wouldn't new that up. I would probably use dependency injection and bring it as a singleton, but I didn't tell GitHub Copilot that, so no harm, no foul. Well, now I'm at the point where I want to make the URL that it calls configurable, because maybe in development I want it to call some other server, and then in prod I want to call some other server. So we're getting into the ability to configure our application, our award-winning application, based on which environment it's deployed to, where runtime variables, runtime configurations matter. So I ask it, can you change for me where it gets that URL from? In maybe dev, I wanted to get it from an environmental variable, and then in prod, maybe I want to get it from the app settings file. So it understood what I wanted to do. And it even knew that it had to create a constructor. It had to include, as part of that constructor, the dependency injection. I mean, that's probably how I would do it. You could theoretically new this class up, but I'll keep that a sidebar discussion, Zach Gardner. Stay on topic. It knew I wanted to bring in an I configuration, which I'm very familiar with that class. That's how you interact with your app settings files all the time. And it knew that if my app setting was null for that particular configuration, that it should try to pull it from an environmental variable. It did exactly what I asked of it. And funny enough, something that it didn't do, this exposes one of the limitations that I ran into very early on in GitHub Copilot, which it is January 2024, February, I don't remember when this recording is going out, when this event is. It didn't add the NuGet package in, which I know that one doesn't come in by default, and that's why the red squiggly lines, the dreaded red squiggly lines, are there, letting me know that, hey, something's missing with I configuration. So I'm like, all right, dude, this is happening. Why am I getting red squiggly lines? I just got out of college, I've only used Java before, and now I'm in C#, and I see red squiggly lines, and we're talking about vars and the CRL, Common Runtime Language. Like, what is this thing? So I'm like, okay, why are you getting red squiggly lines, dummy? Like, wow, it's happening because you didn't include these Microsoft extensions configuration. But it also is like, oh, and by the way, if you wanted to, you can also use this Microsoft extensions configuration abstractions, why not? YOLO. So I'm like, okay, well, pretend. I didn't know the difference between those two NuGet packages. Which ones would you use? It's like, well, I don't know. Let's ask it. So I think, yeah. So I asked it, I was like, all right, tell me, what is the difference between these two? Why would I want to choose one over another? And it gave me words. This is actually on the GitHub Copilot chat, the one that's on the right-hand side as a sibling to the Solution Explorer. And it told me things. I can't honestly say that I fully understood those things, but I knew that I needed to add the first one. That's just the right one for my use case. And funny enough, I actually asked it, can you show me what it is to add that NuGet package in? I was like, I explicitly told it, add this NuGet package in. And it was like, sure, yeah, I'll do that, that's fine. But when I saw this prompt, nothing had changed. So it's important to remember in GitHub Copilot, at least as of right now, as of this presentation, it doesn't seem to be able to modify things at a solution level, because you would have to then give it your entire solution. It would have to know what are the NuGet packages, what are the different versions that are being used by other projects in your solution, and it would have to make changes outside of just the file that contextually we're talking about when we're having these conversations with GitHub Copilot. So it does at least make some rational sense why it wouldn't do that for me, because this is a file-specific tooling instead of a solution-specific tooling. Again, this might just be because I didn't read the documentation, but if I, as a chief architect with like 20 years of experience, couldn't figure it out, like, well, maybe you need to change your user interface a little bit, because I have an IDE open pretty much every day. Not as much as I would like, but still pretty much every day. So I added the NuGet package. I used my IntelliSense to highlight configuration. I said, add this using statement in, and it did it. I was like, okay, cool. Now I have my configuration in. I need to define my car model. I created the class. I started typing, and then I thought to myself, well, could I actually use this for code generation? And the great news is I can. So I knew in very vague terms what I wanted to do for the structure of my car class. I knew I wanted it to have a VIN, make, model, year, trim. I forgot mileage as well. And one of the interesting things that I tried to do, I tried to trick it a little bit with make and model, because there's no prescriptive format for telling it how you want it to generate code. You just kind of pretend like you're talking with another developer. Maybe this is your lackey and they have to do your bidding, and sometimes they interpret things a little bit differently than what you intended them to. But it gave me the opportunity to kind of test out, saying, all right, make and model, and then in parentheses strings. It had to know that I wanted a string for both make as well as model. I know, not earth-shattering, but I try to be tricky every once in a while. And the code that it produced was actually pretty good. I was kind of surprised. This is exactly what I would have done. So this was the thing that I think I like most about GitHub Copilot, the ability to take rote tasks, to take things that are just not super high value, not super complicated, don't require a lot of creative thought, and describe what I want to be done using plain text, using natural language, and then it generates for me the code that gets me 70, 75, at least 80% of the way there. This, granted, probably would have taken me, depending upon how quickly I could have typed it, a minute to do. But if you think about it in the aggregate, how many model classes have I written over my decades in software development? If I could take that time and squeeze it down to maybe like 6% less, maybe 7% less, that's a pretty substantial savings on the whole. Multiply that by how many developers at a given company are doing this. Again, there are many other tools that you could be using for code generation, but it's just as a general purpose tool, that's not bad. I mean, I was kind of surprised how good it did. So I'm like, all right, I got my car class. Now I go back to my main method in my service, and I'm like, what? Why you got squiggles? I mean, you gave me this code. You gave me this code to get from a particular configuration section the configuration value. Why did you give me code that didn't work? And it's okay. It's because, AI suggestions may be inaccurate and may produce red squiggly lines that get talked about over and over again. So I asked it, dude, why has it got red squiggles? And it's like, oh, well, it said things again, but it didn't really make sense. I was like, fine, whatever. Change it I'll ask it differently. I'm not going to ask you why it's doing it. I'm going to say, how can you fix the mess that you made? And it did. It was able to know, I don't need to call get values because it's something like get section, and then you got to do get child section if you're going to go the method route. Or you can just wrap that bad boy in brackets, and then it knows how to do that inherently from the configuration providers where it is to pull from. So now look at this. I have two classes, my car class and my inventory service class, both of which were written primarily from GitHub Copilot. The code structure, I probably would have done things slightly differently, but it's okay. I mean, it really wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. You know, I went into this having very low expectations for what it would produce, and what it produced, I mean, it wasn't bad, to be honest. I do still have some concerns, especially at a security and information security level, of exposing your company's proprietary code to just whatever API that is configured to call. What are they going to do with your source code? What buckets are they going to put it in? Are they going to train their model? Are they going to improve their models off of it in the future? Maybe. I mean, they've certainly done that already. So you do have to be concerned to a large degree about how exactly they're using your code. I think 2024, we are going to see the rise of self-hosted code generation large language models. There's a lot out there. You can go on Hugging Face, you know, they're a dime a dozen, so to speak. GitHub Copilot, though, is probably the most orthodox one at this point, probably the most widely used one. So there's good reason for that. What it produced was fairly good. But if you want to use these kind of tools in your company, you do have to have a lot of discussions. Chief Information Security Officer definitely has to be involved. Legal counsel has to be involved to understand if you're putting yourself at any risk in terms of indemnification policies, what it produces. Is it going to be able to produce code that was, you know, potentially copywritten and proper attribution? At Keyhole Software, we actually have, as part of our employee handbook that all employees must sign every year, a policy section on where do we stand on generative AI tools, specifically code generating generative AI tools. We have steps on what you can do and what you cannot do. What you cannot do is you cannot put intellectual property, you cannot put confidential or proprietary information. You can't expose to the internet, like folks at Samsung, I believe, found out, confidential information that you want a GPT to be able to summarize. You know, you could do that, but you're gonna get yourself into a fair amount of trouble if you do. That's not what these tools were intended to. As they grow, as they mature, as they get better at their job, I think there will be a certain amount of productivity gain that we see on the development side. I don't think, however, that what we're going to see is some massive shift in terms of developers just losing their jobs because of these tools. It's a tool like any other tool. IntelliSense certainly hasn't cost anyone their jobs, at least none that I can think of, and that's okay. These tools are tools. They can be effective, they can be ineffective. It's all in how you use them. So I thank you all very much for listening to me rant, talk about red squiggly lines, because hopefully at the end of this presentation, you at least have an educated opinion about what GitHub Copilot is, some of the things you can use it for, some of the things you can't use it for. And if you have very strong opinions, strong feelings about this, make sure to send me a DM, put it in the comments. I really want to hear from you all. If you're using GitHub Copilot now and you think it's the bee's knees, if you're a Luddite and you think that GitHub Copilot is the worst thing since New Coke, I want to hear both of those. So again, thank you all very much for your time. My name is Zach Gardner. I'm the Chief Architect at Keyhole Software, and we'll see you in the future later.